A ideia desse painel é que a gente possa discutir um pouco sobre como a avaliação pode ser uma ferramenta mesmo para construir evidências e para que as instituições possam desenhar políticas e tomar decisões informadas sobre planos de desenvolvimento, e com certeza está super relacionado com o que nós acabamos de ouvir do Ivan, da Dr. Hanan e do Dr. Mark também. Para compor esse painel, eu convido o Rafael Bianchi, que é tutor de qualificações profissionais e examinador Cambridge Assessment English pelo São Paulo Open Centre. Ele também coordena a área de educação internacional do Colégio Santa Úrsula, em Ribeirão Preto, e há 15 anos atua como educador no ensino de inglês como língua adicional, tendo fundado sua própria escola, a Hopeland English Academy. Bianchi também é especialista em bilinguismo e multilinguismo e atualmente realiza pesquisas nessas áreas para a conclusão do mestrado na University of Wales, Trinity St. David, no Reino Unido. Muito obrigada pela disponibilidade, Rafael, e por estar aqui conosco. Tenho certeza que vai ser uma conversa bastante interessante também, e a sua experiência e todo o seu background vai ajudar muito nessa conversa. Obrigada por se juntar a nós.
Bárbara, o prazer é todo meu. Que manhã nós temos, né? Nós tivemos até agora assim, muitas questões. Eu acho que vai ser um desafio para mim, pessoalmente, moderar esse painel com duas figuras tão proeminentes, tão importantes nesse cenário de educação. E I'll do my best, I promise. Tem muitas questões, é difícil de selecionar, porque todas elas são muito interessantes, mas certamente vamos finalizar essa manhã aí com mais um grande talk.
Com certeza. Muito obrigada. Antes de deixar a palavra contigo, vou só apresentar aqui o Stuart e o Alberto, que serão os nossos dois panelistas. O Stuart Kime é diretor, fundador e pesquisador da Evidence-Based Education. Ele também é professor visitante na Universidade de Eberhard Karls e professor honorário na School of Education da Universidade de Durham. Enquanto pesquisador, o Stuart trabalha com temas como avaliação de aprendizagem, capacitação e qualificação de professores, e como professor com mais de 10 anos de experiência no Reino Unido, é responsável também pela criação de programas de desenvolvimento de professores. O Alberto, ele é gerente sênior de avaliação da Cambridge Assessment English das Américas, possui diploma Cambridge RSA para professores de inglês e especialização em formação de professores pela College of St. Mark and St. John in Plymouth, também no Reino Unido. O Alberto tem experiência como professor, formador e consultor acadêmico há mais de 30 anos, tendo trabalhado também como tutor de cursos de qualificação de professores, como o CELTA, iCELTA e o Delta. Muito bem-vindos, Stuart e Alberto. Deixo agora com você, Rafael, para liderar essa nossa conversa. Muito obrigada.
All right, good morning. Let's just start this conversation in English, and then we can use both languages. This is a bilingual forum, so I think we can use both. I have just some initial remarks here, and then I'll be collecting your questions. I don't know if you prefer to stop after the first presentation for us to deal with the questions that might come up, or if we wait to the end of the session so you both can interact. I think it seems better to me, at least, because we can have you both talking about the questions that may appear.
I'm happy to go with that.
Yep. All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. So on behalf of São Paulo Open Centre, which is an institution that has worked to provide high quality assessment solutions to educators and schools all over Brazil, I initially want to express my gratitude for being here today, having the honor of sharing not the stage, but the screen with two of the most prestigious and prominent professionals in the field of assessment and education, Professors Alberto Costa and Stuart Kime. As a moderator for this session, I promise I'll do my best to collect and present your questions and thoughts to our speakers. I personally have had many interesting discussions this year with colleagues of mine that, like myself, work in bilingual education settings and frequently struggle to find the most effective tools to assess the development of the bilingual learner. Assessment as a tool for learning, the topic of our discussion this morning, will shed light on this matter through the experience and extensive knowledge that our panelists will share with us. In the words of Professor William Dillon, assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. And I think the image of this bridge connecting teaching and learning is symbolic as it suggests that assessment is not a compartmented section in the teaching learning process. Assessment is present or should be present in the educational practices from the stage of lesson planning to the final pedagogical documentation. To initiate our discussions today, it is my honor to introduce Professor Stuart Kime.
Thank you very much, Rafael. It's really great to be here, and it's a privilege to spend a few minutes talking now about something that is really close to my heart and something that I think is of real importance to anybody working in education. It's to keep the discussion about good assessment practice going. And today I'm just going to switch over to present some slides, and I'll speak for around about 10 minutes or so on the subject of using assessment to try to promote and enhance teaching and learning. And I look forward to questions at the end. So I'm just going to see if I can share my screen, if I get this right. So there we go. Okay. So I want to start just by saying that when we talk about assessment, I think one of the most important things is simply to clarify our terms. And when I think about assessment, I think about Dylan Williams' a line about assessment being the bridge between teaching and learning. But I also try to think about assessment as being a process and not an event. So I'm going to talk about assessment and tests as slightly different things. And I think of assessment as an ongoing process that is designed, ideally in education, to generate inferences, actionable meanings about our students, about what they know and can do, and what they don't know and what they can't do. But that's only one side of it. And we're going to look at assessment from the point of view as a process for generating information, but also as one of the most powerful pedagogical tools. And so I sort of set my talk and this short presentation in the language of assessment as a tool for learning, and not as a tool for evaluating professionals and kind of performance management tools and so on. So I've asked this question already, what is assessment, and talked a little bit about my view on it, but it's useful to think back to what Rafael has already said as Dylan Williams' idea that assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. And really, one of the things that strikes me when I think about this image of a bridge between two places, if you like, is that the strength of the bridge is what really matters. Sometimes we can build bridges that are too weak to carry the load that is needed. And sometimes we can over-engineer the bridge and spend too much time and effort and money, and we become inefficient. So it's not just a case of assessment being a bridge between teaching and learning. It's a case of building the right bridge for the right task in hand. And sometimes that's where we run into problems in schools around the world, and in the work that I do with schools in all kinds of different places around the world. I find a common theme, and that is when it comes to building that bridge, we don't often have the skills and the tools that we need as professionals in our schools, in our systems, to build the right bridge at the right time to do the right job that's needed. An assessment, as my colleague Rob Coe, who I work with here at Evidence-Based Education, as he's put it, assessment is something that you think that you know about until you start learning about assessment. And I am really committed to the idea that assessment isn't one of those things that, you know, we're kind of born with as a kind of a skill set or as a knowledge base. Just as you know, I had to learn how to drive a car. I didn't, you know, innately know how to drive a car. And assessment is one of these things that in education, oftentimes we think that we know about until we start actually learning about it. In assessment, I would say that there are two kind of key areas of quality. And so when we build those bridges between teaching and learning, what are the things that I would be looking for if I was going to say that something was a well-constructed bridge? Well, firstly, there's the usefulness of providing information. And really, this is where assessment sits very much underneath or behind the curriculum. The curriculum dictates our goals, where we want our children to focus their attention, the things that we want them to think hard about. So assessment should align with that so that it can provide information about that. But then it should also be designed, those bridges should be designed to support our desired interpretations, the things that we really want to know about and be able to say and also to do. And so, as I said before, sometimes we build a bridge that is too weak for a particular purpose, or it's, you know, over-engineered and unnecessarily kind of robust for some other purpose. So we have to kind of fit assessment to the purpose that we're trying to achieve. But then secondly, assessment in leveraging what's known as the testing effect is really, really one of the most powerful tools that we have for promoting learning. But again, it only can do that if it's aligned with our intended learning aims, aligned with the curriculum. So curriculum and assessment go hand in hand. But then there's this other thing called positive washback, which is a term that is used in kind of assessment theory, I suppose, to describe the positive consequences that come from assessment processes that really do promote learning. So students who are more motivated, who have a greater sense of their own academic self-concept, who have greater confidence, all kinds of different affective consequences of really, really high quality, good assessment practice. Then for teachers and for students, there is diagnostic information. Good quality assessment points out what we know and what we don't know, thereby giving us a pathway to follow, to develop the knowledge and the skill that we need to succeed in progressing through the curriculum, to learn the things that we, as a society, as communities, have decided that our students should know. And then finally, the reinforcement and the retrieval element, which is something I'll talk more about in a little while. But as I said before, building those bridges between teaching and learning is something that requires skill. It requires knowledge on the part of those people who are building it. And when we build them, we need to build them to be of the highest quality for specific purposes. And the purposes really are about providing information and promoting learning. So I said already that assessment is a process, and sometimes it uses tests. And this is where I find quite often there is if you like, a mismatch in what people believe assessment is. And in the work that I've done with schools in places such as Australia, in China, in North America, in South America, indeed, there's sometimes I find a misconception about what assessment is and what a test is. An assessment, as I said, is a process, and sometimes it uses tests, but not always. You have been assessing me. You've been generating information, generating interpretations about me and about my presentation today. That's a form of assessment, but you haven't been necessarily testing me. But tests, which are, certainly in my experience and the work that I do, are something that, that get a bad name. Testing can be seen as a bad thing. But actually, there's really pretty robust research evidence that seems to suggest that testing provides a whole range of different benefits, or at least it can do. And Roddy Roediger and his colleagues published back in 2011 a paper that set out the 10 benefits of testing, as they put it, and those are here on the screen. I'm not going to go through them in any detail right now, but if you search for that paper on Google Scholar or other places, you'll find it quite readily. Incidentally, when I spoke to Roddy Roediger about this paper, he said that when they did their initial work on it, they actually only really found 8 benefits of testing that could be sort of summarized in the research literature. but he felt that a paper that was entitled "The 8 Benefits of Testing" was not really as compelling as one that said 10. So they separated them out a little bit. There you go. Who knows? So testing as part of an assessment process, to both to generate information, but also as a process designed to promote learning, is something that can be woven into a lesson, a classroom practice quite readily. But in order to do it well, in order to do it in a way that doesn't disrupt a lesson and achieves the cognitive benefits of retrieval, it has to be done by people who really know what they're doing. But whether you use no kind of practice testing to retrieve and to promote learning, whether you use that or whether you use any other sort of kind of questioning, what we tend to find in the research evidence is that the same thing kind of recurs. That multiple choice questions or short answer questions or different kind of forms, whether you mass them together or space them out over time, is generally superior to not doing it. So using tests as a tool for learning is one of the most powerful things that we have as teachers. And part of the reason for this is that good tests create what Robert Bjork at UCLA has talked about as desirable difficulties. So basically there's these kind of situations in which a student has to think hard about something. And it's the act of thinking hard that's the thing that is reinforcing what they, the knowledge that we want them to learn. The very act of trying to get it out of your head is one of the best things that you can do to try and keep it in your head. So testing is something that seems to have really, really kind of strong effects. Again, another set of results here. Using practice tests versus restudying, a more passive form of kind of not, trying to solidify your knowledge base. Actively practicing, trying to recall information to retrieve it, is generally speaking a superior way of trying to use testing to create, to promote learning. Sorry, but it's not just what you do, it's the way that you do it. And for anybody who is familiar with 1980s pop music from England, then you'll perhaps know this song by Funboy 3 and Bananarama. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. And I use this simply as a metaphor to say that testing can be used very poorly. It can be used in ways that are demotivating, that create excessive workload for teachers and create an evaluation culture that threatens teachers' professional self-concept and students' self-esteem. Or it can be used for quite the opposite, to motivate students to identify what they know and what they need to do next, and to support teachers in making the decisions that they need to make each and every day to help students make progress. But as I've said before, assessment is not a skill set and a knowledge base that we just happen to have as part of our sort of growth through life. It's not something that we just pick up by chance. An effective assessment requires practical wisdom. It requires both knowledge and skill and application in context. And it's that practical wisdom that can only come from really strong professional learning. Professional development in assessment really matters. And again, going back to the research evidence on this, what we find is that the most effective kind of combination of of development in this area is when we put together teachers' kind of pedagogical knowledge and their content of their subject with assessment knowledge within a coherent conceptual framework. Basically, trying to join together subject content knowledge and assessment knowledge, and not trying to isolate the two, not dealing with them as independent things. And the reason for that is that doing this allows teachers simply to interpret assessment information in the context of what they're trying to teach. And that sounds really obvious. It sounds really very, very much common sense. But common sense doesn't always translate into the practices that we put in place in our schools and in our colleges and across education systems. And teacher training in assessment is something that has been left to chance in too many countries around the world. And without it, how can we possibly expect to move forwards and to realize the benefits of really strong assessment and really strong testing practice? So as I draw to a close, I want to think about the relationship between curriculum and pedagogy and assessment. And I've put these things very much in that order. The curriculum comes first. Curriculum has to come first. It gives us our guide. And as Christine Council has so wonderfully written here, it's a curriculum exists to change the pupil, to give them new power. Pedagogy is our understanding, our professional understanding of how pupils learn, how people learn, and then a set of tools to help them to do that. One of which I would say is this use of assessment and testing. Assessment sits at the heart of really strong pedagogical practice, which sits at the heart of a really strong curriculum delivery model. But without that kind of professional understanding of what good assessment is and how it works, how can we possibly ever achieve a really kind of logical way of developing strong assessment practices in our schools? And I put this up here simply as a little kind of roadmap for the kinds of work that I do with schools, trying to help them to understand, what good kind of components of good assessment practice look like across the board. And actually, this is stuff that people in schools are learning to do around the world right now. It's not beyond anybody in any school, but it takes time and it's quite hard conceptually if you're not familiar with it. But it's feasible to develop assessment in any school. And ultimately, when we use assessment data, if we produce information as part of our assessment process, we need to avoid those situations in which we have kind of adverse consequences, unintended negative consequences, such as you can see here, when the mysterious data use comes into play, when people believe that data that are being used are correct, when in fact, by no fault of anybody within the system, what we end up with is information that is incorrect or inaccurate or inappropriately used. And if assessment is a process for generating dependable inferences, insights about what students know, then the quality of the data that flows through the system and the way that it's understood by people who use it is really paramount. So I just want to finish by saying that if you go to this website, www.evidencebased.education, you'll find in there a whole load of information about training, some of which well, in fact, all of which is online. But also there are blogs, there are podcasts that we produce for free about assessment. You'll hear in there podcasts with people like Dylan William and John Hattie, podcasts with school leaders and teachers talking about how they've worked to develop assessment in their schools, downloadable ebooks entitled What Makes Great Assessment and What Do Teachers Need to Know About Assessment, all can be found at that website. And I really heartily recommend you go and look. It's the organization that I work for, so of course I would say that. So I'm going to conclude there and simply say obrigado. I'm really happy to take questions at the end of the session, and thank you very, very much for spending some time listening to me talk about something that I truly am really passionate about. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand back to Rafael.
Thank you very much, Stuart. It's always a pleasure to be with you and to hear what you have to share. Certainly we would be here many hours because it is wonderful. I myself have many questions and I see many questions popping up here. Hopefully we'll be able to cover some of those questions at the end of this session, but thank you very much for everything you've shared. I promise I had no idea you would start your presentation with the image of the bridge given by Professor William, but wonderful. That's wonderful. We're connected somehow. Great. Thank you very much. Alberto, welcome. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. And thank you very much, Stuart, for this beautiful presentation. It was very well delivered and you provided us with so much information. I would like to think back on the morning that we've had so far. So we started off with David Marsh and then all the other presenters, maybe talking about plurilingual learning and assessment by somehow looking at the forest. And it seems that now, at this moment, we are looking at the trees. So we are going into the classroom and into some of the specific situations. So thank you very much, Rafael, for this introduction, and thank you everyone who are listening. I would also like to thank Department of International Trade for the invitation to be here today once again. They have been great partners, and it's always a great opportunity to be invited by them and to share some thoughts about assessment, which is one of the key areas our institution is focused on. And it is a topic that I am passionate about. So we're going to continue talking about assessment as a tool for learning. So when people ask me about assessment, and this has been a recurrent question, ever since I came across this statement here, this is how I see assessment, and this is how I try somehow to illustrate what assessment is like for teachers, for learners. Assessment is somehow very closely associated with tests or exams, but I like looking at assessment from this perspective. Whenever a student responds to a question or offers a comment or tries out a new word or structure, the teacher subconsciously makes an assessment of that student's performance. I mean, many of us are teachers, we have been in this situation many times, and sometimes it doesn't occur to us that this is a moment for assessment. It is happening subconsciously, right? So a good teacher never ceases to assess students, whether those assessments are incidental or intended. And here we have two keywords as well. Incidental, things that are happening and you didn't plan for this, and intended when you have a plan. Today we're going we have spent the morning talking about assessment. And when we talk about assessment from different perspectives, we come across those very popular terms related to assessment: formative assessment, diagnostic assessment, and summative assessment, which are the key functions of assessment, if we can speak broadly. So we have formative assessment, which is the assessment that is happening in the classroom, that is done very frequently. It's done by teachers to learners on a regular basis, hopefully. Then we have diagnostic assessment, when we're trying to investigate how much a learner knows about something, or which competencies they have developed, so that we can start planning our next action. Could it be immediate or could it be midterm? And we have summative assessment, which is the moment when we expect the learner to sum all the learning up and demonstrate that they have mastered, learned, or developed competencies. So those terms, they are very popular. And going back to what Stuart shared with us in terms of thought, assessment is something that you think you know about it until you start learning about it. They seem to be popular, very easy terms. People can easily recite definitions for those terms. But what they mean in practice is quite obscure for some contexts. So I would like to highlight two of those functions here. And think about two angles related to this that came to me recently. Formative and diagnostic assessment, in one angle, they have gained a lot of protagonism now in the emergency remote teaching, because many teachers found themselves in a situation where they couldn't put the students in a room and invigilate the students while giving them a summative assessment. So teachers felt the need to diagnose more, and teachers felt the need to assess in different ways. And I mean, I'm talking here very broadly and in very general terms, because we have specific cases. But a lot of teachers felt somehow that they needed more information, they needed more training in order to do more formative assessment, to diagnose moments when there were gaps in learning because of the pandemic. But we can also see this from a different angle. That's angle number 2, which is when we're talking about assessment, in many discussions, summative assessment is somehow seen as the ugly duckling, because summative assessment is a test, or it is an external assessment that comes to your context, and there is a lot of debate about the efficacy and the effectiveness of this assessment with a summative purpose, right? But I would also like to look at this from a different perspective now. We have formative assessment, which is valued by most professionals, but we cannot deny the fact that diagnostic and summative assessment, they are important, especially when we consider the focus of this presentation, which is assessment as a tool for learning. And then I'm going to bring here this element, which we have been discussing recently, especially as a need from teachers, which is assessment for learning. And when I look at those 3 icons here, those 3 big terms, maybe we can look at it and find a compromise when we have effective formative and diagnostic assessment leading on to, hopefully, success in summative assessment. And because those terms also are seen from angles that are quite fixed, for example, the summative assessment is the test, well, summative assessment can also serve a formative purpose if you gather data from this assessment and then you use the data to plan your next action, right? Be it changes in the curriculum, be it specific support for learners. So this is why it's always good to look at them very carefully and analyze the data you gather from each of those moments here. The assessments are not always fixed. They might serve different purposes. So the instruments have their natures, but the purposes can be different, right? Going back to something that is key to this presentation is assessment for learning. When you're talking about assessment for learning, we see that it is an approach that integrates teaching and learning. And this integration generates feedback. And this is the key to assessment for learning, when this integration provides learners with specific feedback. And there are lots of things that we need to implement and incorporate in our practices. So in a nutshell, we can see assessment for learning as, for example, learners and teachers understanding where those 3 points that I'm going to show, for example, where the learner is going. So making sure that the goals are shared with the learners, the aims of the tasks are shared with the learners, and that learners are given success criteria, that is what it means to do well in this task. And then all the points being made clear so that learners can also have the opportunity to self-assess or assess a peer. Find out where the learner is now, so gaining evidence of learning, diagnosing current competencies, knowledge, etc. And then asking the question, how can the learner get there? So what is the gap between the expected performance and the current performance? And how can we help this learner? We need to be able to provide feedback that is effective, that is actionable, and help learners to take their next steps in learning. So all those things, they work in a cycle that needs to be worked closely together, so that we can provide learners with proper feedback and also benefit from all the information that we can gather from assessment. So feedback is key to assessment for learning. And when we look at the cycle of feedback, we can start with a very simple model. So we plan, then we teach a lesson, then we think about the teaching, and then we plan again, etc. But this is a very simple model, but there is something missing here in this cycle. And I think one missing point here is assessment. this is the moment when assessment enters the picture. So assessment here will actually inform whether or not the teaching and the planning has been effective. So you need assessment that you do with the learners, and you need you need this information to plan your next steps. But even though assessment is a crucial point in this cycle, I still notice there is something missing here, another key point, which is not only providing the assessment, and here I'm talking about assessment in general terms, summative, formative, diagnostic, but we need to be able, and that takes a lot of training as well, we need to be able to interpret the results. So that's when the assessment practices, tests, tasks, success criteria, etc., they become feedback. So we need to be able to interpret those results very carefully, and then go on from tests to feedback, but also from assessment practices, which I think is a more appropriate terms if we consider diagnostic, summative, and formative practices, so that we can consider and assess and measure the improvement. But what is it that we want to improve by implementing assessment for learning? Well, we need to start with the learner, because we need to implement those practices, and we need to analyze those results in order to provide individual results and individualized feedback for specific learners. So we provide feedback, and then we take action. And then we also have another dimension here, which is looking at the interpretation of those results and looking at assessment in terms of the class or the group, this cohort that we are working with. And then by looking at those learners in a group, we can decide groups of learners that might need better support. We can decide groups of learners which have been developing, so maybe they need extra practice of something. And also the third dimension is the institution. So interpreting the results so the institution can gauge how well their program is working, what kind of successes they have been collecting, from teaching practice to learners' development of competencies. And then we can see this as aggregated results, and those aggregated results can also help institutions and maybe, for example, big chains, like, for example, the public sector, to plan for the next step. So by looking at data, and from the data, generating information, and information that will guide future action in assessment, and of course in teaching and learning, right? So how can schools make the best use of assessment for learning? I would like to start with something that Stuart has mentioned here, Dr. Levy as well, Dr. Khalifa, ongoing professional development in assessment for learning. Assessment is something that we have witnessed in Brazil, for example. It has been a crucial theme, especially in emergency remote learning. So implementing a program or trying to make change to programs implies constant professional development for teachers, for coordinators, for stakeholders in general. We need to involve parents as well, families, not only the stakeholders inside the classroom, right? We need to consider reviewing and developing the school's assessment policy and practice. For example, many schools still see assessment as having the feared end of term test, because the learners who do well in that test are the learners who demonstrate that they have learned a lot and that they are good learners. But it's a question of considering policy, but also considering specifically practice especially in formative and diagnostic assessment. Because if we teachers are to provide written and oral feedback, we need to make sure that this written and oral feedback is not superficial. We need to consider that this has to be accurate and this has to be actionable. Learners need to do something with this feedback. It's not just like a simple pat on the shoulder. And also, teachers will need support putting those principles into practice. They need to be able to interact, to learn from each other. They need to consider professional development in terms of peer observation, for example, discussions, meetings, lots of learning, so that they can start putting this into practice. And I tell you, it's not something that changes from day to night. David Marsh mentioned this morning the number 30 years if you want to see changes in a big chain. So it takes time, but it takes a lot of training, and we need to be able to evaluate the impact of new strategies that are implemented. When we're talking about evaluating the impact, it's not just focusing on the data you gather qualitatively, but also data that you can collect. It's not just about quantitative data, looking at the results of the tests, but also qualitative data, looking at, for example, practices, observation of teachers, all those things that will add to the numbers that we see at the end of the cycle of assessment. So it's a combination of things that needs to go into place. And I think, Rafael, just before I finish, I have allowed the slides to be shared with the audience. Here are some of the references that I used for this talk. And I would like to thank you. My computer is crashing here, but my last slide is thank you.
Alberto, thank you very much. It was amazing. I see that you have some fans here popping up questions on the chat, and we understand why. I'm included in that group. I'm one of your fans, not only because of the fantastic professional that you are, but also because of the great professional that everybody knows you are. So thank you very much for sharing this, for sharing your knowledge with us this morning. I would like to start with a crucial question, and I would like to invite Professor Stuart back to this conversation. And I think this question summarizes some of the thoughts that I've collected here during your talk, which relates to the cultural view of assessment that we have in Brazil. And I would like to go back to something that has been mentioned by Professor David Marsh when he said that English in some contexts can be seen, in some bilingual contexts, can be a destructive force rather than an additive force in the process of bilingual learning. And I think we can have some perspective in terms of assessment that are similar to that, because assessment many times in Brazil is viewed as something punitive, not something too additive in a learning context, because we tend to label the learner, to label the students by the marks they get from the tests they have. It is something that Paula Costa has shared here in a comment. So I would like you to talk about that. How can we deconstruct this cultural understanding of assessment in Brazil? Is that through the education of teachers? Should we talk to the whole school community, including parents? What is your view on that?
So I think it's a really great question, and I think it's a question that could have been asked from a whole host of different countries and contexts, to be honest with you, including my own here in the UK. I think that you know, from my experience of, for instance, our partnership with São Paulo Open Centre, in conversation with you, that some of those cultural factors come from a similar kind of root cause, I think, and partly that is, you know, that ultimately knowledge is power, and a lack of knowledge means that we become susceptible as, you know, professionals in classrooms and in leadership positions, to you know, not being able to push back when somebody tells us that we should be doing something or whatever. So there is a cultural element to this, and I think that it's one that seems to kind of be to run through lots of different levels of decision making in education. So you might have people in government organizations, people in leadership positions within schools or colleges, people in classrooms, and throughout that, if you don't have a really strong and common understanding of what assessment is, what its limitations are, what it can do and what it can't do, then I don't think there's really any way that you can, you know, create the kind of cultural shift that perhaps you're talking about. So I think that just simply learning about for instance, when you talk about grading and, you know, and sort of summative evaluative use of assessment, if you understand the kind of the way that grading works, the inaccuracy of so much grading, things like the standard error of measurement that is in there, the kind of vagueness of grading, the fact that 100 years of research on grading has told us that when a teacher grades a student, it's never only their achievement in a particular subject. That grade is influenced by the student's behavior, by the time of day, by how the teacher is feeling, by the influence of leadership and their expectations, by accountability. So and we can't eradicate all of those things and create a kind of a totally kind of sterile environment where we can simply grade on a student's achievement. But what we can do is open up a discussion so that all teachers and all leaders and all policymakers are really familiar with what assessment can do and what it can't do. And that's our starting point for then working with students, working with parents and others to share that knowledge so that we can kind of detoxify this really, really potentially powerful thing that actually is the thing that can help all of us to do the thing that we really want to do, which is to help our students to learn more, to be more capable, to be, you know, to fulfill the promise of their lives. And so ultimately, that question that you ask about how you get to that point, for me, I think the only way is through education and through initially educating our workforce and helping them to then educate others around them, students and parents.
I totally agree with Stuart. Usually, I mean, being Brazilian myself, I can talk about our culture related to assessment. It usually tends to be backward looking. So you did well or you did badly, where it could be, on the other hand, more forward looking in terms of you have achieved a number of X competencies, and then you now have the opportunity to develop X, Y, and Z extra competencies in your next moment, be it the next academic year or be it the next semester in the program you are following. And also considering the social impact of assessment as well in terms of rewarding efforts rather than looking at the fact that you didn't achieve a dot point to, grade, or you missed that dot point to something in the grade, will cause you to fail, will prevent you from getting more support. I think it has to be more forward-looking, and the social impact should be made more positive by looking at the rewards rather than the punishment, let's say.
Wonderful. There is also another question here, which I see some questions that are similar, actually, and they're all regarding the pandemic that we're going through. And some teachers are Sibeli Moura, for example. I'll read her question because I think it represents the thinking of some of the teachers that are asking similar questions here. And she says, we used to use rubrics before the pandemic, but with the irregular presence and participation of students in remote classes, we stopped using them. Do you have suggestions to give feedback to parents? And I would add here, parents and students, because I understand feedback is essential to good assessment. Within this perspective, as the concrete evidence of learning are less visible now.
Alberto, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first, if that's okay.
Sure.
Well, rubrics, they fall within the category of success criteria that I was mentioning in the presentation. I think rubrics play a very important role in terms of trying to look at assessment, from a different perspective and moving away from getting a 10 or a 5 or a 0, etc., with no specific description of what that means. Rubrics are excellent, but it's very important that the rubrics are very clear for teachers. And with the pandemic, so many things happening. So many things have happened in teaching and learning. For example, learners not being able to follow certain programs because of a number of reasons. I think, again, we need to consider the analogy of the bridge, but the analogy of the bridge in the sense of working more closely with the community, families, learners, highlighting the importance of this presence in the activities, making sure that access to instruction is also made available, made possible for many learners, so that we can then go back to the rubric. Sometimes we have to go one step back and consider specific needs, build the bridge, and then go back and start using the rubrics.
I have a fairly strong opinion on the use of rubrics as a tool for teaching. Oftentimes, rubrics are designed to help with some kind of summative assessment process. And in some of the rubrics that I'm familiar with, for instance, I saw one recently where the wording for the kind of highest grade said that your work was highly original, whereas you got a grade lower than that if your work was original. I have no idea what the difference is between highly original and original. Equally, from my own teaching background, I used to teach English, and in the rubrics that I was asked to use there, I would see descriptions that says a child, the student mostly does something, and then if they get a higher grade, the student always does something. So these things are, problematic because my version of mostly is somebody else's version of never, and so on. So, but rubrics give us a set of success criteria, and those are important for students because that's where they're heading for. But clearly at the moment, because of the pandemic, our usual practices of using these in the classroom have gone. And when you're trying to teach people online and interact with them, you lose so much of the kind of the nuance of the non-verbal interactions of a classroom that help you to use those rubrics perhaps in a way that you're really familiar with. But whether you're using rubrics as a form of, to provide feedback and to give parents and students a sense of how they're doing, what I would say is two things. One is that the only thing that matters about feedback is what the student does with it. You can provide, a huge amount of feedback based upon rubrics, but if the student doesn't understand where they currently are and what they need to do next, and then they actually do something, then it's a waste of time, a complete waste of time. And I would also say that then my second point is that at this moment, in the pandemic, with all of the restrictions that are there, I would say that we can adhere to a set of good practices, good principles of good assessment. And I would say there that means that our assessments are purposeful, and that they focus in on key areas from the curriculum, and that we then use those principles to design different kind of ways of interacting with students, different ways of them creating or conveying evidence to us. For instance, with simply an oral explanation of something, it takes longer to do, but you can get quick answers to questions, designing different types of questions, multiple choice questions, for instance, to use as a diagnostic tool, because simply as a teacher, you need information. And as a student, you need information as well, and they come in two different forms, but it's a to and fro. Ultimately, I would say at this point, don't try to replicate what you have done before in the classroom. Don't try and assess everything that you have tried to assess before. Limit it to things that you consider are really the most important things. I would say with rubrics, use them as as a kind of guide to the success criteria. But I would say why would you use them if they create situations in which grading, for instance, is creating a sense of students not feeling motivated. If it helps them, then great. But if it doesn't, then don't use them. But also to kind of create that fine-grained feedback that simply helps a student to know with any particular aspect of the curriculum, how am I doing right now? And what's the thing that I need to do next in order to get better? And that's it. And does that need a grade? Does that need a rubric? Most of the time, I'd say no.
Oh.
Thank you very much. I would like to get, because we've been talking about feedback a lot and how important feedback is as it promotes learning, as a tool to promote learning. And you've mentioned positive washback and motivation as a result of assessment. And you said that in your view, practice tests are more effective in that sense than simply restudying and providing memorized content after everything our students studied in class. In that sense, how does it connect to our practices in the classroom? Because as we are bilingual educators here, I believe that we have we see there is a tendency to focus on language solely. And I think personally that practice tests are a great tool to assess learning in general, not only language, because even for students with weaker repertoire, we can assess and find evidence of learning in subject areas. So can you just give us a little more of your perspective in that sense?
Yeah. So you talked there about testing from two different points of view. One, as a teacher, you want information. Has this student learned the vocabulary? Have they learned how to use that vocabulary in context and so on, or whatever it might be? Fine. And that's one side of the assessment kind of coin, because you as a teacher need information in order to do what you're doing. But the other is then assessment as this tool for promoting learning. So why does it even do that? Well, let's acknowledge that for any student or any human being, there are lots and lots of stimuli competing for our attention. Right now, if you're looking at this screen, you see my face, Alberto's face, names, there are chats going on. Thousands of things are competing for our attention at any given time. So that's the first kind of challenge for anybody in a classroom, is to try to get students' attention focused on the things that we really want them to be thinking about. Because only when their attention is focused does that, whatever that information is, have a chance of entering working memory and being processed in students' working memory. And why that's so important is that when students start to manipulate information, and working memory is this space where we hold and manipulate information for a short period of time, when that happens, what we're able to do is to create these networks in our brains of kind of nerve cells and synapses forming together to create neural networks, to create our knowledge structures, if you like. And we can only do that by thinking hard about something, right? It's the act of really having to think hard about something that is at the core of getting working memory engaged and focused on the thing that we want. So how do you do that as a teacher? You know, how do you, like, what are the tools that we have available? And the tools we have available is a really, really good question, a really good task that is well designed to focus students' attention on the content and not on anything else, and then to engage them in something that is so desirably difficult that they actually have to use working memory to, you know, to kind of start to create those networks. But that's not enough in and of itself, because one visit to the topic is not enough. What we then have to do is to consolidate that new knowledge through retrieval, and it's through that constant going back and being asked questions that require you to retrieve that information, that start to embed those new knowledge structures in your head. I mean, literally, you know, neuroscientists can see this stuff under a microscope, can see, you know, these connections being formed. And so retrieval as a tool for learning is absolutely crucial, because it's an efficient way for teachers to engage students in the kind of thinking that we know leads to long-term retention, and also the ability to use that information for the long term, which is what we're all interested in, really.
Alberto, I think we have time for a last question here from Raquel de Oliveira. And I think it relates to diagnostic testing. And she talks about how to use the evidence you collect through assessment to redesign and rethink your strategies as an educator.
That's a very good question. I would say it deserves $1 million, you know, to answer the question so quickly. But I mean, we need to consider, for example, the context in which we are diagnosing learners. Is it because we are starting a new topic and then we want to find out how familiarized learners are with something? Or is it because we want to develop a set of competencies and then we want to establish a certain starting point for learners? So depending on the kinds of instruments and the contexts that you are using diagnostic assessment, you know, you collect this information. If it is a case of a topic, for example, this can be immediate. You can do, for example, and then this is the teacher in me speaking, right? A KWL chart where you start with things that students already know, and that's easy and quick to gather. But if we are talking about a set of competencies, then you might need to consider a more elaborate instrument. For example, a small project where you have a task with a series of steps, and then by checking how far students can go in the series of steps, you can define what kind of action you will need to take, right? So that would depend on two things, I'd say: the context and the purpose for that diagnostic moment.
Thank you very much. We are wrapping up our session here. Stuart, Alberto, once again, thank you very much. It was brilliant. I have no words to describe how amazing it was. We can tell it by the number of educators that are here with us, still present. So thank you very much for sharing all the knowledge you have, or at least some of the knowledge you have. I'm pretty sure it would, as I said, after Stuart's talk, we would be willing to be here for many, many hours. And I think we would still not be able to cover everything we need in terms of assessment. But once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafael, as well. Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you both. It's a real privilege, and it's really great to be involved in an event such as this, and to continue to link in with the São Paulo Open Centre in particular. Thank you, Rafael, for chairing this so well.
I will echo Stuart on thanking Rafael. It was amazing. Lots of questions in the chat and on the Q&A section, and you mastered putting them to Alberto and Stuart. And thank you, Alberto and Stuart, for amazing presentations. I think we had a very good and energizing morning. Thank you all for staying with us until the very end of our discussions today. I will switch to Portuguese, but please feel free to listen it in English if you prefer. Só queria novamente reiterar que somos muito gratos pela presença de todos. Tivemos ótimas discussões hoje e reiterar que amanhã continuamos. Vocês receberão o link de acesso para as palestras de amanhã. Nós vamos conversar um pouquinho mais sobre o uso de inovação e tecnologia em educação, sobre o empoderamento de professores dentro desse contexto de educação bilíngue, e também vamos falar um pouquinho sobre recursos educacionais, soluções que podem ser utilizadas em diversos contextos. Espero que vocês estejam conosco. Amanhã, quando começarmos, a gente vai fazer uma recapitulação do que discutimos até agora e seguimos com as nossas conversas. Ao término do evento, nós disponibilizaremos a gravação na nossa página do YouTube, o UK em Brasil. Vocês também podem entrar em contato conosco no education.brasil, que é o e-mail que está aí no chat, sobre o evento ou sobre qualquer outro tópico. Estamos super à disposição para conversar com vocês, aumentar essa relação e essa troca tão legal entre Brasil e Reino Unido. Então, muito obrigada e nos vemos amanhã.